Hello and welcome to the International Transport Forum's Ask the Author session. Today we're looking at the final frontier of urban logistics, tackling the last meters. My name is Ronan Mackerlane from the communications team at ITF, and I'm delighted to be joined by the report's lead author, John Pritchard. If you're not aware of our Ask the Author session, it's a quick-fire 30-minute session, a 10-minute roughly presentation from our lead author who will bring you through the issue, the methodology, and our key findings and recommendations. And then the main aim is to take as many of your questions as possible. So this report was launched by our Secretary General last month at the ITS Congress in Dubai to great acclaim. It's part of the ITF's Mobility Innovation Hub work, which looks at in a very close way at those cutting edge areas that are becoming hot topics for policymakers everywhere. So with the rise of e-commerce, talk of much technology to fill the gap of last mile deliveries, this report is very unique in that it takes a very deep look at that very small space, the last meter between the good and the actual recipient. So without further ado, I'll let John bring you through the presentation. From now, you can already put in your questions. If you have a specific question in advance, please use the Q&A, the question and answer function in your Zoom window. If you're on social media, on LinkedIn or on YouTube, click on the link to join us if you'd like to ask a question. So over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Ronan. My name is John Pritchard, and I want to thank you very much for joining us today for this session. Today, we'll be talking about our report, which examines last meter freight solutions in cities. I think accommodating this growing urban freight demand in ways that is both sustainable and socially acceptable is quite a critical challenge for cities all around the world. And to this end, if you want, serving the logistic needs of these urban areas is a very complex endeavor. It requires access to global supply chains. And as a result of that, freight operations function at widely different geographic scales, from the extra-urban logistics down to the very last few meters of the delivery between the delivery vehicle and the final destination. Each of these stages of operation face their own challenges, but today we're really going to be focusing on the smallest scale, which can be quite complex, even though we're talking about meters instead of kilometers. So when we talk about last meter delivery, it can be broadly understood as the segment of the logistic chain that covers transferring the parcels from the curb to the hands of the intended recipient. This segment of the delivery has costly components that are tied to access to curb space, which is highly competitive in dense urban environments. And it also faces inefficiencies related to the interaction between public and private spaces. In particular, how can you access these private premises to deliver the packages at the very end? This can lead to costly delays, and it can also exacerbate the issue of missed deliveries. So even though the specifics may vary by context, it is common for curb time to be longer than the time spent driving for these logistic operations. So when we talk about what happens in these last meters, we're talking about what's happening on the vehicle, whether it's a van or a bicycle, whatever it may be, where you have to locate packages, you have to unload them, you might have to consolidate these packages. You have to walk back and forth to the delivery point, and you also have to wait at the door, wait for a response, access the location. So all of this is extremely time consuming and it is extremely complex because of how dense urban environments can be. So given these conditions, there's obviously been a very strong interest from operators and from cities to find better ways to serve the delivery needs of their residents. The search for efficiency and the highly competitive nature of the market has really resulted in a rapidly evolving range of delivery alternatives within our cities. Keeping in mind that context does matter, the question becomes not so much what options should be used for urban deliveries, but which mix of options are the best solution for which context, and how should we mix and match different solutions to accommodate the different needs that you may have within the same city. So even today, the most common last mile delivery concept still relies on a driver in a van or a truck delivering directly to the customer after departing a large depot, which is usually located in the outskirts of the city. Here, the last meter component is performed on foot by the driver. However, missed deliveries are significant inefficiencies, as already mentioned before. And when the delivery can't be made, in addition to the time that you spent being unable to deliver the package, a similar amount of time or even more time has to be spent on a different day or a different time to try to make this delivery again. So the use of pickup and drop-off locations, whether it be retail parcel shops or self-serve lockers, has increased as a way to address this inefficiency in urban contexts. And it also minimizes the number of necessary stops along a route, which further improves the operational efficiency of logistics operations in cities. But what about finding parking for these large vehicles? When you have congested urban areas, finding appropriate parking remains extremely difficult. Oftentimes, in these conditions, drivers have to balance the time that they spend searching for parking, the access time on foot to make the final delivery, and the cost of parking. So the result of this is there's often unsafe practices or illegal parking, or you need to spend there's a costly search for parking that is appropriate for your needs. This has led oftentimes to a shift to smaller vehicles in urban areas, where the use of these smaller vehicles, whether it be, bikes or other forms of small or light mobility, can improve the efficiency of this last mile deliveries. They can contribute obviously to the reduced space consumption and the associated emissions, but they can also reduce costs and improve the operational efficiency by allowing the deliveries to park closer to the intended destination, therefore minimizing walking time. But it should be noted, they do come with the added need for more micro hubs that are often need to be located in expensive real estate locations, because you have less amount of packages that each of these smaller vehicles can take, so they need to be able to go back and pick up more packages. So beyond these already established changes to typical urban delivery operations, there's still a lot of interest in further innovations that can continue to improve the efficiency of these operations. In particular, there's been a lot of talk about breakthrough automated delivery alternatives by drones or robots, which have often been touted as a potential solution to urban logistics. But then the question becomes, how feasible is this? And does this really have, I would say, a large potential in urban areas? To help answer this question, what we did was we simulated the use of these delivery robots and drones in a complex urban environment using our in-house agent-based modeling. I'm not going to go into a lot of details into what this entailed. We can talk about it later, and you can have details about it in our report. But suffice it to say that the simulation included passenger and freight movements, as well as a wide range of vehicles that went from large trucks and lorries down to small micro mobility alternatives like scooters for passengers or cargo bicycles for freight. The potential automated alternatives do vary in size, they vary in range, and they vary in capacity. But what all these have in common is that the feasibility of these suggested drone and delivery robot services remains a significant challenge. In terms of the last meters, particularly in urban areas, we see very little potential for replacing the human component of the last meters with automated deliveries. Without having access to safe locations to drop off these packages, these autonomous solutions would face exactly the same sort of temporal challenges that logistic operators face today, waiting for customers to come pick up their packages on the street or from public sidewalks, having to make multiple attempts of delivery when they're not at home. So in that sense, it wouldn't really solve this issue, which is highly inefficient under current operations in a lot of different contexts. Additionally, in particular, we find that flying drones would have minimal use cases within urban conglomerations. This is primarily due to the fact that you do have capacity limitations coupled with inefficiency use of space and limits on where they can land within our cities. Whereas I think oftentimes we think about small domestic drones, when we talk about the actual delivery drones that are being tested, these are much larger. They can take up 3 to 4 square meters of space, but then they have limited carrying capacities, which can be usually below 5 kilograms. And to be fair here, most of sort of the business to consumer sort of parcel are within this limit, but it does constrain the ability to combine multiple packages. And in terms of the ratio of space consumption to capacity, it's just not very efficient in the urban areas. Sidewalk variation of surface robots were found to have more likely sort of potential uptake in cities, but their penetration was still significantly below the potential of small surface vehicles like e-cargo bikes or other bike delivery alternatives. So while right now what our findings show is that we found that the specific case uses for automated deliveries are yet to fully develop, it's important to keep in mind that it remains possible that they may play some role in the future of cities. And because of that, it is critical for policymakers to be prepared. A critical component of this is ensuring that sort of any innovation in whatever shape or form that it takes contributes to better outcomes for residents and does not come with outsized negative impacts. But being prepared doesn't mean that we should forgo solutions that are feasible and can be scaled today. We believe that given the low potential of automated deliveries, and particularly drone deliveries, the policymakers should be prioritizing feasible last meter solutions that really fit the context, rather than focusing on these high-tech potential breakthrough technologies that may never scale. Here, we would like to highlight using pickup points as one solution that can significantly improve efficiencies in highly dense urban environments. However, having said that, an ecosystem that encourages innovation from the private sector is desirable. And although right now there's no clear avenue of how we can have a broad uptake of these automated deliveries, as I already mentioned, policymakers need to stay vigilant, and they need to encourage safe innovation in their cities in whatever shape or time that they may come, right? So in terms of any form of automation, whether it's for logistic operations or otherwise, policymakers really have to recognize the added legal complexities that will come if you pursue this avenue. In particular, I think the issue of legal responsibility for any sort of incidents that occur and the issue of space prioritization are critical components that policymakers need to be prepared to address. Any automated solution in our cities cannot come at the expense of the safety of users of public space, and particularly pedestrians, I think, if we're talking about sidewalk robots, for instance. So to do this, I think policymakers need to establish effective policy frameworks to manage urban freight operations and to safeguard public interest while allowing for its innovation. I think we can all expect, seeing how quickly things have evolved, that last mile solutions will continue to diversify in the coming years. And this will only increase sort of the competition and the existing tension that we see in terms of street space use and street space allocation, their priority, and how we prioritize this space use. So, regardless of what sort of innovations come into play, authorities really have a few key things that they need to decide very carefully. First, where and when certain services should be allowed to operate. If, where, and when we should prioritize their movement over other uses of this space. What are the physical requirements for their operation? And importantly, particularly we talk about automation, who would bear the responsibility for incidents and who would intervene to resolve emergency cases? This is what I have for you today. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll pass it off to you again, Ronan. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, John. A lot of food for thought there. It's your chance to send us your questions. What do you want to know about the last meter of urban deliveries? John is at your disposal. We have a few early questions already in. A reminder to you, please use the Q&A, the question and answer function, to take your questions. So John, I mean, you cleared up in your presentation some of the aspects around drones, the use of drones for these last deliveries. An early question is in, nobody mentions drones without mentioning vertiports at the moment. So this question asks if you could address some of the challenges that make vertiports so difficult to manage in urban areas in a context where we have so much press talking about drones landing on buildings, etc. Can you speak to that question, John?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, first off. And I think the critical issue with vertiports are how can you implement this at a large scale? And there are several sort of key things that really hinder this sort of ramping up of this. The first thing is to consider is, just the rooftop design. Flat roofs might meet the requirement to be converted to be used as one of these ports for drone deliveries, but other types of roofs that are often common in lots of different places, you have angled roofs, gabled roofs, mansard. I'm not going to go down the line of all the different types of roofs, but that might be a little more difficult there, right? In addition, already at the rooftops, these are used for all sorts of different things, right? So you have mechanical, electrical, plumbing installation. So how are you prioritizing this space there? In addition, you have sort of the security component that is very, very interesting. And from a policy perspective, I think the legal considerations here are very, very complex. So we're talking about private properties, buildings, being used by external private stakeholders, who's responsible if there are any sort of issues? And again, if you think about every building having to have one to really scale up the use of drones in our cities, how feasible is that? And finally, and I think this is really, really important, is how complex sort of urban airspace is in terms of the management. Cities might be responsible for the rooftops, but they may not be responsible for the overall sort of airspace above them. So how do you manage this at the different scales of policy are questions that are still unanswered, and not to mention sort of the cost of retrofitting roofs all around the city to kind of make it work. So I think right now there's a lot of questions about kind of having a broad uptake of drones in cities.
Thanks, John. Indeed, a lot of considerations. Keep your questions coming. We have plenty of time to take quite a few more. Giacomo Losi asks, are the delivery companies that you consulted for in the study aware of the potential and shortcomings of the options that you presented?
I would argue that they are. I think if you look at sort of reported media, all sorts of companies ranging from Amazon to FedEx to a lot of other sort of companies have had pilots in the last 10 to 15 years, whether it's on drones or sidewalk delivery robots. And a lot of these have failed and they have discontinued these. So I think the difficulty of pursuing these sort of solutions in urban context is well known among companies. It doesn't mean that we can't get to a point where this makes sense. You know, right now we're looking at what do we have right now and whether it's feasible right at this stage. And the truth is that going back probably 2015, we were already being promised drone deliveries in the imminent future. And that hasn't really come to pass. And I think it really speaks to how complex it is to kind of implement these in cities in a safe way. And I think this is not a surprise to any delivery company, but it is a challenge to be met, right? So again, I would argue that potentially down the line, there could be sort of innovations in terms of the delivery methods that could make it useful. But right now, I think we're all aware of where it goes, despite the hype.
Thanks very much, John. The next question is in from an anonymous attendee. We do allow questions from anybody who's clicked on the registration link. Thanking you for the presentation, asking, will the presentation be available? Yes, it will. It's already on. This is a live broadcast. It's available on the webpage that's in the chat. And I'm just giving you a reminder of our upcoming event in Korea in December, which is part of the ITF Innovation Mobility Hub work. There's a link to that event in your chat. And the question is, secondly, do you have any pilot case studies on urban logistics that you recommend, particularly involving drones or robots? So I guess these are examples of pilots that are working rather than not working, John.
Yeah, actually, I'm not aware of sort of pilots that are extremely successful. I know, for instance, in Korea, which you just mentioned, where they have large sort of like, you know, for instance, I think there's been some pilot studies in Korea and elsewhere where they're trying to look at using them not so much for the last meters, but within large compounds, you know, and I think there could be a potential use there. But I mean, I would kind of fall outside the purview of what we're doing here. In terms of pilots that, you know, were discontinued, I think, you know, you can look at sort of Amazon had a delivery robot, sidewalk delivery robot that was discontinued, even though the drone sort of a program is continuing. FedEx similarly kind of tested some different things. So I think for the time being, I don't have any large scale sort of pilots that come to mind, but I think it's a niche market right now that it's difficult to kind of expand out to a greater scale.
Thanks, John. Great question from Louise Node, who is interested in the greenhouse gas emissions implications of urban freight and the various options. So does this report explore that, and what are the results?
Yeah, so we didn't do in-depth analysis on the emissions. However, we do kind of touch on it in the report, more reporting on what we see, so more from a literature review sort of perspective. And I think there is a point where, especially for aerial drones, there are still open questions whether they can even deliver on a sort of any environmental gains. You have to keep in mind that you're lifting sort of a mass from the ground, and this is not necessarily the most efficient way of doing this. So in terms of sort of environmental gains from an emissions perspective, if these drones are electric, let's say, obviously they won't contribute to local pollution and to further CO2 emissions, but the same could be said for, small electric vehicles like bicycles or any other kind. So there, I wouldn't say there's necessarily an advantage on the automated component of it.
Thanks, John. And I think you have pre-answered another question, which is, are there any data and insights on the energy efficiency of delivery robots or drones vis-a-vis a delivery by an electrified cargo bike? I will put in the chat our environmental analysis work as well that you can peruse, which answers many of those questions. So we'll go to the next question from Wang Guing Choi, who asks, are there any particular industries or exceptional regions and conditions where you still see these type of delivery methods? And I presume you mean, one, the automated delivery methods still having potential.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of different things. I think they could be better suited for, let's say, intermediate sections of last mile delivery operations. So, your restocking depots or micro depots, because in these conditions, you have dedicated loading bays and facilities, which could kind of lead to having a more, let's say, seamless transition between cross-dock and the other segments of the logistic chain. So I think that's one thing to approach. The other thing is, again, I've mentioned that it's a niche sort of component, but what that does mean is that for, highly expensive goods that really need to be in a particular place in a particular moment, it could be cost efficient, right? Additionally, I think when you think about non-urban areas and suburban areas where you have less complex airspace limitations, I would say, probably a greater likelihood of having available private secure landing spaces, for instance, in a field or, a backyard, whatever it may be, maybe it could make sense to use these for last meter deliveries in those areas, right? Because it could improve delivery speeds and accessibility. And I think the other thing to note there, where like drone delivery to remote areas of medicine and that sort of thing has been trialed, and there are sort of quite extensive pilot studies, even beyond pilot studies, particularly in Africa, where they have explored how you can use this, right? But like these are goods that are high value and need to be delivered very quickly to remote areas, and maybe that's where you have a greater sort of potential uptake and a greater use for these sort of automated delivery drones.
Great answer. Thank you very much, John. There's a quick poll on your screen to let us know if you find these Ask the Authors useful and good. I certainly do. And I like the next question from Sten Vandal, which is one of the reasons I like Ask the Author, because we have to think outside the box sometimes. So Sten asks or states that there are several startups using pipes underground for transport of small pods. Pipes that are under 1 meter in diameter, using propulsion by electric engines, on rails, or pneumatically. So these free up street space and are high capacity. Does the report cover any of this underground logistics? By the way, I happen to know these existed in the past and got disbanded. It's actually an old technology as far as I know. I believe New York City was using delivery pods within the press sector and around Wall Street. John, does the report?
Unfortunately, now I wish we would have thrown it in there, but it really wasn't one of the options that we considered. I didn't see any sort of real movement on the, let's say, literature where this was one of the potential things that we were looking at, but certainly seems interesting, although I can see several pitfalls just from hearing it right now, right, in terms of security, in terms of scaling it up. And again, that's probably better suited for sort of these intermediate state of logistic chains where perhaps, you're going from sort of hubs outside the city to inside the city, but where you control both ends of the tunnel, so to speak. Maybe that could be a possibility, but this is not something that we really looked at or that I've thought about much. So I don't have too much to add there.
That's your next report right there, John.
Exactly.
The next question is on a similar vein. We've pretty much covered it. Under what conditions and where could automated deliveries be more efficient and more effective, I guess, than what the current state is? Do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think we pretty much covered it. I think obviously there's a space for it, but I think if you think about, for instance, it just has to be less dense. I think that's a clear sort of component that I keep coming back to, because when you think about cities and how complex and it is and how many things are interacting at the same time, the only way to really make it very efficient, let's say you have a sidewalk delivery drone, is you have to give it priority. And under what conditions are you giving priority, and who are you prioritizing this drone over, right? If you have lots of people on sidewalks, you have all these different sort of interactions that just add to the complexity of making it sort of a large scale solution. And I think, especially when we think about large scale solution, do we have to think about, like, is this what we want from a well-being perspective? Do we want a city where we are, we have 1,000 drones kind of moving around the sky at all times, and we have to be watching out for automated delivery drones, small deliveries, robots on the sidewalks? Is this really going to improve sort of the well-being of citizens in cities? And is this really sort of what we want? And I think oftentimes the answer is no. Like, we can't accommodate the amount of these that it would take to kind of fully replace our current standards with that. But it can be part of the solution, I think.
Thanks very much, John. So I think we have time for just one more question. If you have another one, do pop it into the Q&A. In the meantime, I'll send you a link to our upcoming webinars and events. Many of them you can join online, and there's quite a few coming up between now and the end of the year on cutting edge topics like this one. And a great last question, unfortunately, again, from an anonymous attendee who wonders how come this last step of delivery, the final 50 feet, as they say, seems to have drawn so relatively little attention to date, or have I just missed it? They wonder. Is this very much a new area, John, and why?
I think it has drawn very little interest in general. I think one, it's just a matter of scale. People think it's very small, and they don't look into it very far. I think also within logistics, there's a strong sort of history of operational research, where you have all these different problems that you're trying to optimize routes, and you forget that you're optimizing routes, but this last component is really hard to optimize. So I think it is an issue that logistic operators and logistics researchers are aware of, but because I think sometimes inertia and the way that we've been like educated and taught to think about these things, it doesn't come to the forefront, or it feels like something that it's not for us to kind of optimize. But I do think it's a little bit of a rising tide where more things should be coming down the pipeline.
Thanks very much indeed, John. And it's Karsten Hulesman admits to being the asker of that question. There's no problem at all, Karsten. We thank you very much for it indeed. If there is nothing else, I've just put into the chat ways to keep in touch with ITF. As I say, we have an awful lot coming up lately, and you will be very interested in that December conference in Korea. So it just remains for me to thank John very much for an excellent report and an excellent presentation, and to thank you all for your participation and for your great questions. And see you very soon for the next Ask the Author.
Thank you.